Let's move to the second section of our discussion today. And Keisha, if you can put the slide up for us. For the next 15 minutes or so, we want to talk about you all's process as researchers and scholars, and uh, give our folks who are joining us a chance to talk through some of this with us. We have a number of educators who have joined us, might have some students out there too. Let's talk about the researcher's process. When you go into your archives, or if you're looking for information in secondary literature, what are some of the key themes that you all explore? What are some of the key ideas that you're curious about? What are some of the challenges you faced? Uh, Talk to us a little bit about how you work. What is your work process? What is your both your interrogation and your creative process? And then we'll get into some thoughts about teaching Milwaukee history as well. But let's have a researcher's conversation for a few minutes. Tell us how you go about your craft. Reggie, you want to start for us?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. So, most of what I've looked at is the African American experience in Milwaukee, going back to the very early days, and look at the transition of different groups of Blacks who came here from, different parts of the country, and how that's impacted the Black experience. One of the key things that I've done research on over the last couple of years, and I'm working on a book about, is kind of the history of segregation in Milwaukee. And not only how segregation played out, the practices and policies of it, but the impact of those practices and policies, even on how we look today, what our communities look like today. And a big part of it is really exploring some of the things that other people have written. I've used a lot of John's research. I tell people all the time that I've learned more about white people by studying the history of people of color than I've ever learned in my life, because people are always in those spaces together. We tend to kind of segregate things. We talk about African American history, Native American history, whatever, but it's really, you can't separate those, because people were in those spaces together. And really a lot of what I've learned is about the practices and policies that impacted Blacks in terms of segregation. You have to explore where those came from and why white people wanted those practices and policies in place. And that really has helped me to understand why Milwaukee became, this very kind of segregated region when it came to African Americans coming here in larger numbers in the 50s and 60s, for those manufacturing jobs. And then just as importantly is what's happened to Milwaukee, especially the central city, since those manufacturing jobs started to dwindle away. What was left, thinking about the 30th Street corridor and all those old factories that are still there, that are vacant buildings, and what the neighborhoods still look like now.
Reggie, I often say in class, uh, it's very complex in some ways, that because of Jim Crow, Black Southerners in particular and white Southerners were actually in very close proximity.
Mm-hmm.
The history of Jim Crow, the way we think about segregation would suggest otherwise. But in fact, it's because of Jim Crow in a lot of ways that the social proximity is far closer and far more consistent in terms of contact than we realize. Joe, John, either you guys want to jump in, talk a little bit about your thoughts and your curiosities?
How do you work, Joe?
Oh boy. Well, I tend to dive right in, and I think that, to Reggie's point, that he's learned so much about white Milwaukee by studying Black Milwaukee and the experience of Black Milwaukeeans. I think that kind of was a similar experience, but flipped for me. I remember early on in the process, explaining my idea to Rob, and he said, boy, it really sounds like you want to write about Black Milwaukee, but I did it kind of by describing Germanness. And so I kind of dove deep into, I'm really interested in how ethnic groups, particularly the Germans, because, as Johnny said, that's, so much of the city has been shaped by German Milwaukeeans, and thinking about how over time they've talked about that identity. And so it was a lot of just sitting down and reading, and things that, and kind of rediscovering things that are familiar, but then reading it with a new light, and kind of thinking about, all right, how does this inform what it means to be a German Milwaukeean, and what then on the other end of that does that tell us about how they engaged with space and place and understood racial and ethnic belonging in the city. And so, and to that end, I think it's really important. So, historians are really concerned with the archives, right? As we should be, and the archives are our church, kind of. But I think the city is, the city itself, it's important to think of the city itself as its own archive, right? And so I really enjoy just getting out, walking around, driving around, and thinking about this space and the people in it, how we interact with one another as a historical product itself that we need to understand as well.
If more people thought like you, I think I'd want to be a historian.
In terms of my process, I think in terms of storyline, I think of where we are in 2020 is the most recent chapter, and go back and seeing how we got to this chapter from the last chapter. So you look at deindustrialization that we're still in the throes of, and where did that come from? It came from industrialization. And what did that do? That brought a whole lot of people up here. And why was that? Because there were resources, because there was innovation and entrepreneurship. So you kind of see this procession of forces and moments that ended us here, May 13th, 2020. But go back in Milwaukee's case, Native American times. So trying to trace that story and all the questions that at every single one of those pivotal points is raised, by seeing where we shifted. The questions become obvious, the more you think in terms of story. In terms of finding out what the stories are, talking to people, there is no substitute for that. I've interviewed thousands of people in Milwaukee over the years. But you also have to have the historical record, and my second home is the humanities room at the Central Library. I spent so much time there. My mother would call me there on occasion, because she knew I'd be around. Sometimes, or the librarians, kind of, they had a question they thought I could answer it. I'd be handed the phone. So I've been sort of, for many years, kind of absolutely dependent on librarians and archivists. I'd be selling insurance if it weren't for librarians and archivists. The other one is the County Historical Society, which also has a first-class collection. And for a lot of things, including newspapers, Wisconsin Historical and Madison, that's a wonderful resource. We are well served. We are well served in this community, by the resources we have to try to do that storytelling. So it's kind of, in terms of the writing process, that's a little bit different from the sort of one step beyond the research process. But I tend to think in terms of puzzles, almost spatially. I look for the edges. Kind of, what are the edges? What am I not going to go beyond? So you need to do that, to kind of sort of define your territory when you're doing any kind of writing project. And once you have the edges, then you work very painstakingly, kind of putting those puzzle pieces in the middle. Hopefully you come up with something that has some coherence.
Reggie, you have a good puzzle metaphor too. I've heard you use it a few times.
Yeah, I've spoken about this idea of kind of how we explore history is kind of like giving someone a 1,000-piece puzzle. Mm-hmm. And you can give it to them in one of two ways. You can give it to them, you can give them the box with the cover on it, or you can give it to them with the cover off of the box. So they have the 1,000 pieces, but they don't know what it's supposed to look like when they put the puzzle together. And that's really what historians do, is they paint the picture. So they give you the cover, and then that's, like John said, it's a very painstaking process of figuring out how to create that storyline and the narratives and telling those personal stories to help people understand, like John said, how we got to where we are. But really, I've always liked the idea of thinking of it as this giant puzzle where we get it and we don't have the cover, and we have to figure out how to make that cover as a story. That's what we do.
I've extended that metaphor a little bit. I feel like sometimes Milwaukee is a trash bag full of puzzle pieces, and you're not sure if it's like 3 puzzles or 10 puzzles or Like you don't even know. No one tells you there's 1,000 pieces. It's just a bunch of it's just a bunch.
Right.
You got to start putting. You got to find the edges in the corners for sure.
You know, folks, for our attendees, we're going to move to Q&A in just a few minutes. I do have a question here that I want to throw out to you really quick that came from our attendees, and it's about radical geographers. One of the things that I learned that's been very beneficial is to borrow and learn from other disciplines and think through how, as a historian, other disciplines help to complicate narratives and provide some complexity to ideas. One of those arenas, one of those disciplines that has been very sort of a fringe value has been geographers. I did not know how to think spatially. I didn't quite understand it. And then once I began to work with colleagues who are geographers, I learned a deeper appreciation for the importance of thinking about space and race and all of that. Have you all bumped into any work from radical geographers? Have geographers played a role with some of the ways you think about race and community and neighborhoods and spatiality and all those words?
My terminal degree is a master's in geography. You know, I've had no academic standing in history. And what I was doing at WM was kind of a historical geography, which is the intersection of time and space. You know, and that's where I live. That's pretty much where I live. And it drives me nuts when I read any history and I get a sense of a place. You know, everything happened someplace. Everything did. It had to. But often that's kind of the whole dimension that is ignored and neglected in historical discourse. So that's something. Yes, I've benefited greatly by geography.
Yeah, one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen. There's an old map of Milwaukee from the 1920s that's at the library, the Golda Meir Library at UWM. And it's a map of the neighborhoods in Milwaukee, and it's color coded by ethnic group.
Yeah.
And
Associated Charities. Yeah,
that's cool. It's a fascinating way to see, you know, that period of time in Milwaukee, how segregated, you know, different ethnic groups were. And, you know, you really never think about it because we just assume, you know, all of these white people living together in harmony, but you see that they created very, you know, spaces that were comfortable for their particular group of people.
That's a cool map. It's one section that just like 6 square blocks is Austrian.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's really,
Like,
really
for sure.
You know, panelists, as you all talk about the various archives and institutions, you got a thank you from Tanya over at the Public Library. Wanted to give you a shout out, John. I know we've got Kristen over with the Wisconsin Historical Society. We might have somebody else from the Milwaukee County Historical Society in the mix as well. So I appreciate you all highlighting the very rich troves and collections and all of that our institutions have provided us around this question. One more question and then we'll move into Q&A. Talk a little bit about how you teach Milwaukee history. Some of your approaches, some of your ideas. You know, if you're standing in front of a room, if you're standing in front of a classroom or you're giving a public lecture, talk about how you teach Milwaukee history, anything that jumps right out to you.
You want to start, Reggie?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I found is that young people particularly prefer to not study history in the way that older people do. They look at it differently. They're disconnected from it. So one of the tools that I use is really to look at the role that young people have played in the history of Milwaukee. So when we talk about the open housing marches, we talk about, you know, the campaign to desegregate the schools. You know, I engaged the young people in conversations about what those young people were doing at that period of time, and then have them explore what they think they would have been doing if they would have been a young person in high school at that age. So really to kind of bring them into a space where they can kind of see their peers instead of just, you know, hearing the same old stories about Father Grappi and Vale Phillips. You know, talk to them about some of the younger people that were there. And it's a much more engaging way of looking at history from the perspective of young people when they can see themselves in the stories.
And we're the predominant authors of the open housing marches. I think that's been something that sort of haunted us as we've tried to share the story. We say to young people, this is your story, but if they have heard of it, it's been centered on adults, so it, they give I think very well justified side eye.
About you, Joe?
Yeah, well, just maybe to second Reggie's point exactly, I think that, it's important, particularly for young people, to see their place in the city's history, right? I mean, you live here, right? And you have a place here. It's really important to emphasize that. Even if you're the newest newcomer, you're still part of this history. So I really try to highlight that, and I really try to produce in my classroom a venue not only where people can see themselves in the city's history, but also engage with it, one-on-one, right? And I think we would be remiss if we didn't also include in our list the folks over at the Golda Meir Library and the archivists at UWM and the American Geographical Society Library. And
I love the shout outs. Keep them coming.
Yeah.
That's great. I love
right.
it.
Well, and being at UWM, we have the benefit of just being able to go across the street and engage with these materials one-on-one, and being able to be hands-on historians in the classroom. And I think that that's really important, because then, this is definitely a profession and a practice that we all need to exercise, right? Thinking critically about ourselves in time and space and in relationship with one another.
Yeah, I
We
want to
are-
just add, Joe and John have both shared, their fondness for these archives. My wife used to tease me that I was spending too much time at the Golda Meir Library. She was wondering if I was meeting some woman there or something. But these are places that we enjoy being in those spaces, because it has stuff that we enjoy, that we're looking for, and it's a place where you can engage in the work in a way that you can't in any other space. There's so many resources at all of these places that have been mentioned that people in Milwaukee just don't know, the treasure trove of valuable information about the history of the city. And I don't think that the average person would ever enjoy those spaces as much as we do. But they're my favorite places to go in the city.
Getting lost in time. So I think of that.
Absolutely. What'd
In
you say,
terms
Reggie?
of my approach to teaching, I don't do formal teaching, as you do, Joe or Rob. Reggie, you've regular classes or not?
No,
No.
I used to be a teacher in MPS for 8 years, though.
Okay. Most of my stuff is one-offs. I think of myself as a writer more than a teacher, but I talk a lot to adult groups, mostly, but also to kids. And what I really take pains to do is to tie past and present together. To make sure that the story I'm telling, the points I'm making, have some relevance to who we are today and where we are today. Having the sort of antiquarian approach, I'm fine if people want to study the British monarchy, but it's not a sort of clear and present relevance to me. What's important to me is kind of who we are now and where we are now. So I sort of take pains to underline those connections. Also, we did the Making of Milwaukee documentary series, and from the very get-go, we raised money to put together a curriculum component to that entire series. So you can go to Making of Milwaukee, you can Google that and go to it's a tab called In the Classroom, and we have hundreds of pages of both resources and lesson plans, almost packaged activities for all grade levels to study Milwaukee history. And that's been, we've done some in services. Now they call them PDs, professional developments. It used to be called in services. We've done a number of those for MPS teachers and others. But I think that it's really important to share the past with our future. And that's been a lot of what that whole curriculum effort is about. It's been well received.